Well, I did say also in the agenda of the email that we just take a couple minutes and try to set a little bit of a tone for the day and kind of, again, to move you out of the classroom and kind of some time around colleagues, around some of the good, the bad, and the ugly that maybe we see in the existing documents that we're working with. And this is really meant just to kind of stimulate some thinking on your part and maybe think, hey, I got to go back and watch some Western movies. I haven't seen some for a while. But this one, I'd like to sort of start with just an observation around the good, because the ministry announced this year when they were talking about the new curriculum implementation, and I'm not sure that they really acknowledged it appropriately. And I think it's important that when we sort of decide where we're going next, and a lot of folks that I'm talking to, they're hearing things like, well, we had this person come in and talk about inquiry. Well, what, should I be doing that? There's place-based learning. There's all these different pieces pulling on me. What should I do? Well, I think it's important to remember something that was published by the BBC back of August of last year. And you may or may not have seen this particular statement here, but basically what they did is they took the international scores from, I believe it was the last PISA 2015 set of tests, and instead of analyzing Canada and then placing Canada, and we were above average, but we weren't in the top tier by any means, they stripped the provinces that tested enough students out. So they were able to strip out Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And when they did that, and then they re-ranked all the countries with the provinces, Quebec, Alberta, and BC were in the top 5 for math, science, and language arts. And I think that's really important. I think that's probably really important for everyone to know, and I'm not sure everyone knows that basically I interpret that as meaning we're doing a pretty good job with science. And it's not like it just happened yesterday. Change takes time in education, so we can go back 20 years probably, say what was going on at that time, the curriculum, the resources, the support that we had. All of those played into basically building a pretty good science program. And it may not seem like that at times, especially since we've been underfunded for so long. But the reality is that we are all doing a pretty good job, probably better than pretty good. And the article goes on to talk about one of the reasons for that is the way that we address equality, and I agree with that. But Ontario didn't fit in the top 5, and they address equality the same way we do. So there's something more going on there. And so in the good, as we move forward, I think it's important to remember we're already in the top 5. And so when we're making decisions now, they're based on, hey, we think this is going to be better for our kids. We think this is going to be better for how we engage them and how we teach our science. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward there. I will say that I did have dinner one night with a couple of the people that were on the committee that wrote the curriculum, and I asked them about this, and they hadn't heard that. And their response was basically, well, we'll see what happens. I don't think that's a good enough response, right? And I'm recording this so that I can share this, and I don't think that is, right? I think they should have gone into those meetings, and those are really important meetings, and they have a really important job, and they should have known that we already were near the top. And how do we continue to stay there? So, as we talk about the changes and the pressures that are on you from various places, it's important to keep that in mind. And if you want to find that article, you just need to go BBC, Canada, superpower, education, those words will find that article for you as well there. Okay? So there's good there, I said sometimes we have a good curriculum because we've gone through some revisions in the last 20 years. It's been a bit dodgy, but when those times happen, there seems to be a lot of in-servicing, a lot of support, and people just kind of buckling down and knowing what to do. And so it's good resources, it's clear goals, but honestly, in my 30 some odd years of this, I really believe, and I've said this before as well, we just have really good teachers. Like, people don't say that often, but I get to travel the country and everyone's doing a great job, but sometimes I see the things that are going on. How do people pull that off, right? It's like, so I guess we're just acknowledging that the good probably ties a lot into that. So we need to celebrate that as well. The bad, I'm not going to spend too much time on at this particular point, because I guess, we're at a spot now where we just need to move forward. There's challenges in there. Probably the biggest challenge is about 300 million somethings a year that we're missing for 15 years. That's probably our biggest challenge as we sort of start to refund the system. And as I forget who I was talking with earlier this morning, we're implementing with very little support. There's a new curriculum coming in, and there's not a lot of new money out there. So that is a challenge as we move forward. But we will persevere through that. I put a little comment into myself there as well around the flashbulb event, and I'm not sure if it fits within the bad, but it kind of fits within something I read in. It was in this book, so it's called A Reader Come Home by Marianne Wolfe. If you get a chance to, it's called The Reading Brain in the Digital World. It was a great book. She wrote another one called Proust and the Squid, and it was a bit of a struggle. It was a very academic book, but her editor got her to write more. And it's a series of letters just talking about where we are with kids, the brain, and reading, and the impact that has when it comes to deep reading. And I think that's a huge piece of what we do when we teach. We need our kids to be able to read well. And they're novice learners when it comes to biology, chemistry, and physics, and they need that. They need to be able that support to read. And when they read online, it's different than when they read on paper. And the research is building and building to show that. And so there will be, part of the bad is everyone, I think, seems to think we can do it all through digital. I'm not so sure about that. And so it's if you get a chance, it's worth picking that up. But in there, she mentions a study by Malcolm Gladwell connected to memory. And I don't know if you've heard of this idea of a flashbulb event, but sociologists identify certain things in our life happen that are big and they're emotional, and we remember them. And so what the studies have been in the past is when those events, like say Pearl Harbor, for no one in this room, but what they would do is they would ask, a year later, what do you remember about Pearl Harbor? And then they'd check with them 5 or 10 years later. And they were doing these kind of things, and they were seeing something was happening to people's memory. And so when 9/11 happened, they thought, hey, we have a flashbulb moment. Everyone knows where they were the morning of 9/11. So the next day, that day actually, they got approval to do this study, and they brought in 3,000 graduate students, and they just had them on September 12th write down everything they did that day. So they wrote it down, then they asked them a series of questions and recorded their answers. And then a year later, they did exactly the same thing. 2 years later, they did exactly the same thing. 5 years and 10 years later, they did exactly the same thing. And they found that 10 years later, the story of their memory of 9/11 was about 60% different. That's pretty wild, right? And they found most of the change happened in the first couple of years, where it was, they started to move things around, and things happened and some things didn't happen. And so, when we're starting to, I've heard people say, well, we're trying to, kids are different, we need to find different ways to engage them, they don't remember what they're learning. Well, we didn't remember 60% of what we did the day of 9/11, and that was a big deal. It had all the impacts of what makes a memory: emotional, personal connection at some point, lots of visual stimulation, all those pieces were there. So, I think, we need to sort of keep in mind as we're moving forward that maybe things like, as we learn more about how the brain learns, we need to take that into consideration as well. So that may not be so much of the bad, but I think it kind of ties into a little bit of what I would call sort of two things that are kind of bugging me about this particular curriculum. And, you know, I think I have found some sort of peace in knowing that once I vent about it, then I think, okay, let's get on and let's find some solutions to this. So that maybe I'll see if I can do the same for you and stimulate some thinking there. But this one here kind of threw me a little bit, not threw me, but it's the first statement in the curriculum overview. And you've all seen it, probably heard it before. But the comment at the top, that today's students will grow into a world that is very different from a more connected than that, a world that's more connected than the generation before. So that idea that somehow this generation is special, that it's different, and that we need to prepare them in a different way. If you get a chance to come across this book, it's called by, I guess it's Dr. And for the most part, you know, you've got I guess the baby boomers and then Gen X and then whatever letter kind of all the way through. You know, things change a little bit. Sometimes we're drinking more, sometimes there's more sex, sometimes there's more of hanging around at home. But since the smartphone came out, everything is changing. And it's in the last 5 years, and when you see the graphs in here, the majority of them, and granted she cherry-picked a little bit, are dropping down. Things are changing. So there is something going on. What it is, I don't think it's got a lot to do with learning. I don't think it's got a lot to do with the actual how we learn, but in terms of the world around them and the things that are happening and why they're maybe developing more empathy, but now also having more anxiety. You know, these kind of things that I'm just kind of curious about those. And so if you want a good read, it's really quick and easy. That's one worth checking out here. But just to go back to this statement here, today's students will grow up in a world that is very different. I found an interesting headline out of the Vancouver Sun, and I just realized I forgot to take it out. And it was in the Vancouver Sun, and it was in the BC Teacher magazine, which I believe now is online. So this was a couple of years ago, but I keep it in my briefcase because it's a good reminder for me. So it's a BCTF publication, and it talks about a quote from the Vancouver Sun because it's an article kind of reflecting this idea about generations being different. And so it says, the Vancouver Sun carried a one-page feature that boldly proclaimed, "Education is taking new turns in a world of change. Emphasis for youth must be on how to think." And it goes on to talk about, in this article, the article describes the computer as the pace setter in what is becoming an age of rapid technological and social change. Anxiety about this rapid change is the rationale provided for much of what follows in the article. It is up to the education system to prepare people, students, to cope with the economic, social, and psychological problems mushrooming around them. So you might argue that statement kind of aligns with that. Yeah, it's sort of in there. Except that this was published on May 30th in 1966. So I guess I'm saying, I was born for the record by then. I guess we're saying there that, you know, we hear these things and every generation is special and different, and they are. And our generation, that whatever our generation was, is special as well. But we also need to balance that with the good. You know, what we're doing, we know that internationally we are doing well. And it's important to keep that particular piece in mind when you hear, this is why we're changing. So two things that sort of bother me about this curriculum. One I call the WYSIWYG, the what you see is what you get phenomena, and that is that everything is so general that you can see whatever you want in it. So if we were a group, instead of say science teachers, but we were all different groups from various NGOs and lobby firms, and we were all trying to influence, how this curriculum was going to play out, I think everyone could find something in there to support their point of view. And maybe in some ways that's what curriculum is about. But the reality is, when it comes to teaching senior science, we all have a story to tell, and it's the story of our subject. And there's important pieces to that story. And as I say to folks all the time, I could do an inquiry project on Newton's laws, but I can guarantee you there isn't a kid in North America that is going to discover Newton's laws through an open inquiry project. They're just not. It's not possible. It took a lot of people, it took a really smart guy 300 years ago to kind of put it all together. So to take the accumulation of human knowledge and say, well, yeah, you can just do an activity and the kids it'll come up with the answer, I have some problems with that. But the way the curriculum is set up, people think that could happen. It's so general. So I think it is up to us to remember what we've been doing and go back to the good. And yeah, there are things we can change and there's things we can bring in. But what we're doing is there's not a lot wrong with what we're doing in terms of the story we're telling. Maybe we can tell it different. Maybe we can find different ways to engage. That's why we're sharing ideas. But when you look at those general statements, we need to also remember what we've been doing before and not lose that. Because it is a pendulum, and the pendulum is going to swing back, because history says that it does. And so, sometimes staying the course a little bit isn't a bad thing either. So I struggle with that one a lot because we all see different things. And so every time you're talking with someone, you're not even sure if you're talking about the same thing. And then the other one, and this comes from my curriculum days back in the mid-90s with the ministry, when we wrote curriculum, there were times where we put words into the learning outcomes purposefully because the learning outcomes is the law. And so if the word microscope is in the learning outcome, it means that has to be funded, right? If it's mandated that every student it's expected the student will learn how to use a microscope, well, to meet that learning outcome by law, there has to be a microscope. And for some reason, in this particular curriculum revision, that when it was going through, that idea was lost. And I think because everyone focused so much on the competencies, which, correct me if I'm wrong, we've always done. We've called them skills, processes, whatever. But people are talking like they've discovered something new. And I was like, no, it's called inquiry. We've been doing that for the last 300 years, and we do in our classroom since we started teaching. It's called hands-on, and it's connected to content. But now those words aren't in there, so you don't have to fund skills, right? We're developing skills, but in science, for those skills, well, you need equipment, you need different materials. And so what sort of gets me going a little bit with this one is that I think part of the reason we're not seeing funding is the way the curriculum is written. So we need to look for other ways of finding that stuff, but it's going to be a challenge, right? I really believe that it's going to be a challenge. So those are kind of two things that are kind of getting me going a little bit, and sort of this. But I always remain back to the good, in the sense of what we're doing well already. So we're starting from a really good spot. So going forward today, I guess, you can think of it as, some considerations for next year. The other thing I kind of like that's sort of resonating with me is I heard the statement, finding the signal through the noise. So there's all this stuff going around you and all these demands being put on you. And hopefully today allows you to maybe focus a little bit more on that signal for science. For you and your chemistry or your physics or your biology. What's your signal? What are you trying to get at? And that's what we're trying to focus in on today and help you build that and make some sense of what that will look like as we move forward. And so to do that, we have time today to engage, to connect, and then hopefully eventually as the year goes on, share. And if you have some good ideas either later today or during the year, then we have some way of sharing that out. And if we can stay focused on those three, then I think as a group of science teachers, we have a chance of putting this all together in a pretty cool little package. So as we move into our groups, I leave you with a new Latin word that I learned from this other book, The Short History of Truth, which I just did a nice short one, easy to read. In the post-truth world, what is truth? But for those of you that speak Latin, if there's anyone out there, I apologize. I don't know if you've seen this one before, but sapere auda, dare to know. And that just really stuck with me, dare to know. That's kind of cool. You know, it's like maybe that's what we want our kids to be doing, is to dare to know. So, you know, when we're doing this, let's push them a little bit farther. Let's just kind of dare to figure this out a little bit farther. And maybe that's what the curriculum committee was going after, right? When they talked about inquiry and all those things that we're already doing. But maybe we just want to push our kids a little bit more and take them out of the comfort zone of their screen and sort of their virtual world, and bring them back into the real world, because that is what science is, right? It's the study of the world around us. It's not the study of what's on our screen watching someone else doing it. It's understanding the world around us. And so maybe we just need to dare to know a little bit more. And maybe that's our signal that we're working with.